We're certainly seeing a lot of interest in Europe, to say the least. Our next guest, John Bussey, will talk to us about how the psychology of business and the psychology as it relates to our own human adaptability will have some impact on the Euro crisis. John, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Coming right on set.
My pleasure.
You have some really interesting comments and some observations in your column, The Business.
Yeah. Well,
tell us, do we overreact as investors, as business people, particularly when we see this large, unfathomable puzzle known as the Euro crisis continue to unfold year after year?
Yeah, what do I do?
Yes.
Is Greece going to fail? Does that matter? Do I pull my my money out of Germany and France, which seems so stable? It should just be Italy and Portugal, or not at all.
Right.
And what researchers find is that this is going to shock you. CEOs are human, just like the rest of us, and they are subject to the same kind of foibles, the same kind of thinking that people use when they're trying to do risk analysis.
There you see the chart on the screen there. This is what some companies are doing. They're moving the cash home, keeping the inventories lean. Certainly they don't want to have a lot of inventory in Europe, trimming their investment, which probably is the worst thing perhaps they could do, and bracing for slow sales. I don't know what that last one means, but, but go on, continue what you were saying, please.
The expectation that sales will slow, and so what do you do about that? Well, you kind of begin to reflect that in your balance sheets and your discussions with analysts. These are all incremental moves, and they're kind of in keeping with what psychologists say that we do when we face risk. We look at risk and we say, okay, well, how do I feel about it? What's my intuitive sense of this? We still relied way disproportionately on an intuitive sense, even in business, on evaluating risk. And at the basis of that is kind of what's worked for us in the past. And so that kind of leads to a conclusion that there's a kind of a proclivity to stay the course, to make incremental moves like this, and to kind of muddle through crises, rather than make a radical reaction to them.
Right. So what you're saying is that we are hemmed in by our own experience, and that if we were trying to be as absolutely rational as we could, John, we would maybe have a greater range of variation. We would pour a ton of money into Europe, say, as an investment, or take everything we can out, move out all of our employees, and brace for the worst? Is that it?
Well, those are all possibles. And you see hedge funds kind of reacting a little bit more in that way, people who kind of spend their time with risk. Businesses are different, and there's a lot of precedent for this. So pretty much all of the crises that we've seen abroad, you've seen incremental moves like those. Okay, so the Russian financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the various Latin American financial crises, upheaval in China in 1989, the global oil shock. Business kind of looked, how do I adjust to this incrementally? I don't want to make a radical move, and I certainly don't want to make a radical move in a place like Europe, which has a lot going for it. It's not only this enormous market.
The rule of law, first and foremost.
Yes, that's critical, and that's not shared by a lot by business in a lot of other markets. Huge cultural affinity, lots of integration with European businesses, and therefore a globally shared interest in a stable outcome to the crisis. And that's really important. There's a lot of players at the table, none of whom want to see this thing pitch upside down.
Right. So there's the 2006 study that you cite in your column, and I think we'll have some of its results there on the screen. Check your gut, preparing for Europe's abyss. There you can see our intuitive feelings, right, are predominant, something you mentioned earlier. So is it possible, John, for us, not just as people, but people in business, to separate those intuitive feelings from our rational minds?
Yeah. Well, I think there will no doubt be some who do. More of us, the predominant share of us, are really kind of subject to our own sort of intellectual process, but also our physical process. There's another study that'll be in the story that shows that when traders at a London trading floor were exposed to high levels of stress, their cortisol, or stress hormone, went up. If that goes up during extended periods of stress, during extended kind of flushing of the brain with cortisol, you get a bad reaction. It's, cortisol can kind of help you deal with the stress. It kind of helps you focus.
Fight or flight reaction.
Right, exactly. Right. And over an extended period, it makes you basically kind of hallucinate and focus too much.
So perhaps we're in a cortisol-induced kind of Fantasia collectively.
You and
Given
me,
that
generally,
really...
that's entirely possible. Business in general about Asia, also entirely possible. That at times the extended periods of stress could lead you to make a misjudgment. There's also there's also studies that show that during really particularly fearful moments, we actually tend not to sort of have an optimism bias, which is the fundamental kind of way that we react, and that's also a kind of problematic in business, that the natural inclination for human beings is to be optimistic in their forecasts. I figured this out, right?
Sure.
I got it down, so I know what's going to happen. But the flip side of that, it's on the other end of the sort of the other tail on the distribution curve, which is that when things are really, really fearful, we are absolutely certain the worst thing is going to happen.
Right.
Terrorism is a reflection
So shouldn't
of that.
we, and we have to go here in just a moment, John, but shouldn't the end conclusion be, hey, it's not going to be as bad as we think? Is that the optimism bias coming through, or is that the rational mind coming through? I can't separate the two.
Right, that's right. It's probably a bit of the optimism bias coming through, but also you're making a judgment. You have an intuitive feel on what's worked in the past and how business has managed to navigate those previous crises. And if we connect those dots, our logical conclusion will be they'll navigate this one too.
Right. Hey, John, mind over matter, heart over substance. I don't know which one it'll be, but thanks so much for sharing your reporting with us.